Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Right, perfect. Welcome to the launch of this report, Helping Europe's Digital Economy Take Off, an Agenda for the Next Commission, which has been commissioned of the CER, Centre for European Reform, by Europe Unlocked. So it's this time of the political cycle in Brussels. We're a few months away from the start of a brand new European Commission. The report launch is quite timely, since you obviously waited for Mrs. von der Leyen to confirm she's standing again for a second term. It's not a shoo-in that she'll be endorsed by the European Parliament, but I think a lot of people are predicting that that will happen in the July plenary. My job is very simple. I'm the moderator. I'm Paul Adamson, obviously, and I'll make a very brief introduction because we haven't got much time. The idea is that each of my distinguished members of the panel will make brief opening remarks of around 6 to 7 minutes maximum, allowing for a discussion at the end, say of half an hour. We'll try and finish around 6 o'clock, but since we're starting about 5 minutes late, we may go at a wee bit over 6 o'clock. And if you can stay, if you haven't got more pressing engagements to go to afterwards, there'll be a drink as well, so hopefully you can stay for that. Let me briefly introduce the panel. On my immediate left, Milena Jabůrková, who's the Vice President of the Confederation of Industry of the Czech Republic. Then Meyers, who's the author of the report, Assistant Director of the Centre for European Reform. Renate Nikolay, Deputy Director General of DG Connect at the European Commission. And last but not least, probably the most high-profile MEP in this broad tech sphere, Axel Voss. Welcome to everybody. Right, I think the clock is ticking, so without further ado from me, Milena, you start, please.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I will just add to my my introduction that I work for IBM Czech Republic, so I work for US company. And thank you for invitation and possibility to speak today. The Confederation of Czech Industry is the biggest employer association. We have 36 industrial associations, which we serve as umbrella, and about 200 corporate members. I'm glad that this debate is happening 2024 because it's an important year for the Czech Republic. We fought for accession to the EU, and it happened 2024, so it's 20 years. And we knew that this step will be key not only for our economic success, but that it's also existential necessity, because without a membership to the EU, we would be forgotten outpost blazed by the wind from the east. But how this relates to today's debate, the point I'm making is that context matters. So when we are talking about potential, Europe's potential and priority for the next Commission, to have aspiration and measures right, we have to look at the context we are in today. And for those who likes history, we can draw some parallel with 1930s. We have war waging in Europe. Hitler sits this time in Kremlin. And we experience the gravest attack on rule-based world order since World War II. And autocracies are creating new evil axis, and to make it possible for authoritarians to grab any territory they choose to, irrespective people's will. And we have to bear in our minds that Europe, the US, and free world are their targets. And also, digital technologies play an important role in this battle, be it in trenches in the East Ukraine or in the political arena around us. Just look what's going on in the US. If you watch the struggle for the democracy, I think it's much more nerve-wracking than a fictional thriller on the Netflix. With one serious difference, the end will impact our future. So we also have to bear in mind that very probably it will be a technology advantage that will make sure that democracies will prevail. So, and if we look what was happening under this commission with all positives which were achieved. So predominantly we saw the push for European sovereignty. And in the Confederation of Czech Industry, we don't think that this is the right path, and that's why we partnered with associations, business associations from 10 member states to believe that a new approach is needed, approach that is based on opening potential. And this very good idea came from our Swedish friends, and it's called Europe Unlocked. And so from the policy standpoint, what we ask for, we have like five recommendations. And the first, most important, is complete the single market. Because this is our crown jewel. If we want to be competitive, innovative, more attractive, we have to conclude a single market. It was a huge success, but time has changed. And over the last decade, the barriers stayed the same, especially in services, or even were erected with regard of digital technologies. So what we need here from the Commission to move from much ado about nothing modus from more existential be or not to be question. Second is small think small first when it comes to regulation, meaning avoid preemptive, heavy-handed regulation and focus on solving the problem, make it failures in specific areas and sectors, and mainly please base it on rigorous impact assessment. Third is open new market opportunities, new trade opportunities, and resilient sourcing. Fortress Europe is not a solution. We need to work with trusted partners and allies. For example, build the safe data spaces in international frameworks, or collaborate on economic security with our partners. Because united we fall, united we stand, divided we fall. Fourth, we agree that investment into digital infrastructure is needed because it underpins innovation, but don't allow beg thy neighbor policies. Productive and market investments are good for uptake of new technologies like AI or quantum, but industrial policies based on subsidies work against the single market and exacerbate differences among member states. And finally, focus on securing enough of an agile workforce with skills that are needed for digital era, because we cannot do it and we cannot succeed with skilled people. That's all for me.
That's perfect.
And we will deep into it, I hope, during the discussion. Won't we, Renate?
Thank you very much, Milena. We'll certainly dig into that, as you say, afterwards. Zach, you've got a few minutes to present your report, at least the recommendations.
Thanks so much, Paul. And again, thank you to Europe Unlocked for kindly sponsoring the report and this event. Now, as Milena laid out, the EU is really focused on economic security right now. And I think that needs to be coupled with a recognition that the EU is also suffering from really slow economic growth, which is a problem which virtually all of us understand and are living with. And I'm quite concerned that if we focus on economic security at the expense of growth, we're going to see an equivalent to what we see with climate change and the green bash, where the policies that we need to make Europe economically more secure will not be accepted. And so when we think about ways to boost growth in Europe, one way to boost growth is to work harder, but that is extremely difficult. We've got a skills crisis, Demographically, we've got an aging population, and we have limited political appetite for higher immigration. And so what we really have to think about are ways to work smarter and not just harder. And that means we have to use technology to build a more digital economy and to boost our productivity. My report, which is published today, looks at the digital economy in Europe through two lenses. Firstly, it asks how do we get businesses in all sectors of the economy to better use and better incorporate technology. Europe is constantly focused on how do we innovate, but they sometimes forget that when it comes to productivity, what really matters is the dissemination and the use of technology, not inventing it. The EU missed out on the IT productivity boom, which America witnessed in the 90s and the 2000s, and so we desperately need to catch up on better dissemination of technology. The second lens that the report looks at is how to boost prospects for European tech firms and return Europe to the forefront of digital innovation. Now, on these two lenses, my report finds that we have kind of a mixed report card. So we have some good progress, but also big problems. Large firms are doing quite well in adopting new technologies like cloud and AI, but smaller firms are falling behind. And that is a huge problem, because when you look at highly productive economies, it's the small firms which are more experimental, which work out how the best ways to exploit technologies, and which then disrupt incumbents, creating competition and forcing all firms to be more innovative. So we really have to think about how do we get small firms to adopt technologies, something which Europe is not doing well. Secondly, Europe is getting much better at launching tech startups. The numbers look quite good, but the problem is that they're not able to scale. And so US tech startups are much more likely than European ones to succeed long term. Europe's share of global ICT markets has roughly halved since 2013, and so this is an area that really should be of alarm to policymakers. Now, a lot of the steps to solve these problems are going to take time. One of the obvious ones is building a capital markets union so that Europeans support more investment in technology. That is going to take time, and so what my report looks at are what are some things that we can do to fix these problems fairly rapidly. The first area that the report looks at is regulation. Regulation can absolutely be a force for progress, and you just have to look at Europe's climate initiatives, which helped it become a global leader in many green technologies, as an example of good regulation. But to achieve the same success in boosting the digital economy, regulation has to support innovation, particularly by smaller firms, and it has to make our economy dynamic. Regulation can help deliver that when it gives firms confidence to use technologies, when it makes consumers happy to use them, when it provides assurances that technologies are safe and legal to deploy, and most importantly, when it promotes competition. But in the last few years, I would say that the EU's digital laws have really provided kind of a mixed scorecard on those counts. To pick out two examples, firstly, I think good regulation should deliver a clear and consistently applied set of rules for tech firms, which would then help innovative firms use the technology and grow and displace less productive firms. But in reality, the regulatory landscape is incredibly complex. I mean, I look at digital tech laws in Europe full-time for a living, and it's extremely difficult to kind of get your head around all of it, and I don't have to run a business at the same time. So you can just imagine what it's like, you know, for small businesses that are trying to understand the, I think it's 116 acts that have been passed in the last 5 or 6 years that touch on digitalisation. Complexity scares away small firms, and so it is wrong to assume that more regulation is necessarily going to make it easier for small firms and harder for the big ones. It's in fact the largest firms that have the biggest ability to cope with complex rules. A second principle is that good regulation should set out principles and outcomes that firms should achieve, and then let them work out what is the best way to deliver those outcomes, including by using technology to achieve them in ways that are really efficient. But too many digital laws in Europe seem to be very prescriptive, and which risk locking in suboptimal business models, market structures, and technologies, and therefore preventing the sort of innovative disruption that we really need to see. Now, what I'm calling for is not a bonfire of regulation by any means, especially since a lot of the EU's digital laws do have good objectives, and we need to recognise that having them is sometimes better than having a patchwork of national laws that would be even harder to comply with. But what we do need to do is think about how do we make regulation simpler, more consistent, and more future-proofed. And how do we build on, as Milena said, Europe's single market and its commitment to market openness. My report points to lots of good examples of where the EU has done this really well. I would look at, for example, at the way that self-regulation is used in the Cyber Resilience Act, and the sort of rules that apply to large platforms in the Digital Services Act when they're looking at disinformation and having to prove to the Commission that they take it seriously and that they've got measures in place. But the law doesn't say exactly what they have to do because, of course, those firms are better placed to understand how to manage those risks. The second part of the report is on the data economy, and I think this is an area where Europe has huge potential. When GDPR was passed, lawmakers thought that it was going to unleash a whole range of kind of privacy-friendly digital innovations in Europe and that would be at the forefront of exploiting data, and that clearly hasn't been the case. Now, the Commission understands that industrial data is really an area that Europe can exploit. And by industrial data, I mean non-personal data, data that's not covered by GDPR. And the Commission's passed lots of laws like the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, which really ought to be making an economy around non-personal data easier to create. But I think the elephant in the room here is that firms are largely dealing with mixed data sets where personal and non-personal data is intermixed. And what we really don't have and need to see is regulation and guidelines that give firms answers as to how you can anonymize data or produce synthetic data and make it easier to separate out the non-personal data and do exciting, innovative things with it. This, I think, has really, really great potential. For example, when we look at the AI Act, if you're running a high-risk AI system, you have to prove that the system isn't going to be biased. And the best way to do that is by using anonymized data sets that don't include personal information. The third part of the report looks at digital infrastructure, and this is obviously a really important topic right now. We know infrastructure is an absolutely key enabler of innovation. No matter what else you do around the regulatory framework, if you don't have the connectivity in place for firms to adopt AI and cloud computing, then they don't even have the choice to use it, even if they want to. So many studies show a direct correlation between connectivity on the one hand and GDP growth, productivity and innovation on the other, and that's completely unsurprising. However, I think there's two problems here. The first is that coverage of connectivity in the EU is quite patchy, and when you look at poorer, more rural areas, the places that would benefit the most from being able to get connected and be part of Europe's digital economy, the infrastructure is just not there. And the second thing is that competition and regulatory attention, especially including in the Commission, it's focused so far very much on price and on rollout and not so much on quality. And if you look at the 5G rollout, it's been very much driven by mobile telecoms companies who are kind of upgrading the antennas, but they're not upgrading the underlying infrastructure, the core network, to really unleash the innovative power of 5G. And so we need to think about how are we going to get incentives in place to allow telecoms companies and to give them the capability to roll out that investment. The telecom sector has obviously pointed to poor profitability as a constraint on new investment, and it's raised a number of prospects which I think are initiatives that I think have been somewhat controversial. My report kind of sticks to things that are kind of basics but also really important, and I don't think anyone would disagree with. The first is it's just got to get easier to roll out infrastructure. In the latest legislation that aimed to make it easier to roll out infrastructure, member states really pulled back on this prospect that there should be deemed consent or the ability for companies to roll out infrastructure if local authorities are taking too long to issue permits. And that's something that I think we're going to have to look at again. When you look at the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, on green investment and green infrastructure, the EU and member states know that if you want companies to roll out infrastructure, you have to make it as easy as possible, and we need to apply those same principles to telecoms. And secondly, on finding ways to get the market to support more investment, so competition isn't just focused on short-term price. An answer here has got to be to get telecoms companies to scale. And I think rather than looking at in-country consolidation, which I think raises some risks around raising prices, which could then dampen the demand for digital services, a better option is to look at how do we get these companies to scale across Europe, because we don't have a telecoms single market in Europe. You have lots and lots of companies that are really active in maybe one, maybe two countries. And to do that, we really need reforms in areas like radio communications, cybersecurity, data retention, all of these areas where different national laws mean that it just doesn't make sense for telecoms companies to do cross-border mergers because there aren't the synergies. So to just conclude, I think in boosting digitalisation, The current Commission has not done a bad job by any means. I really commend it for understanding the challenge, for setting largely positive targets, and for making progress. But we really have a huge task ahead. I think the EU really needs to focus on its strengths, which are deepening the single market, backed by having a consistent digital rulebook across Europe. And this whole point of the single market is to supercharge competition, because we want European businesses that take technologies, find great ways to do innovative things with them and become more productive, to be able to grow quickly and to force other firms out of the market. This is kind of disruptive, positive competition. I just want to end by just pointing back to this question about economic security and tech sovereignty. I just don't think that we can get our security better by becoming poorer and becoming less productive by closing our eyes to technologies that are available overseas. And nor do I think that Europeans generally would accept that approach. I think the best way to think about economic security is how do we become indispensable to our trading partners? And we do that by pushing Europe to the forefront of innovation. And in my view, the way to get to the forefront of the innovation is to make sure we're making the best use possible of all the technologies that are available to us today and using them as a springboard to get ahead. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Zach. Renate, it'd be interesting to see to what extent you share the analysis of Milena and Zach, and any hints you can give about how the next Commission, the European Commission, whoever ends up being the president, will address these issues. Over to you, Renate.
Thank you very much for having me here. I agree actually with a lot of what Zach said. First of all, that we didn't do such a bad job in this because honestly, I think when you look at regarding the digital transformation, what this Commission has started to do is to complete the regulatory framework, going for the big issues, but also working on being involved in the technological race, so that technological innovation is supported as much as possible, and giving a policy framework that kind of brings everybody up to speed. What do I mean by that? The tech regulation, and people say Europe has become the tech regulator. I feel it sometimes when dealing with the DSA and the DMA enforcement every day, because it is a big job. But I think it's important to underline that this tech regulation is really driven by a double objective. It's yes, we stand for a regulatory response. And you rightly said it's in order to kind of use to the utmost the biggest benefit that we still have, and that is the single market. It is sometimes better to agree on common kind of rules of the game for everybody in the union instead of having the mushrooming of national solutions. And for instance, if you look at platform regulation, if we hadn't done it, we would have had by now, probably 22 different national laws. Much better to have a common approach. I would say the same on AI. The pressure was very hard for member states to come in and give certainty on what direction of travel, what kind of AI does Europe stand for, and I think here again, also looking at the final result, I think it's an interesting piece of a smart regulation that tries to be, yes, framing in a risk-based approach what we stand for and what we see as potential kind of needs to have safeguards ex ante, but for the rest, it's kind of open the gates for AI applications. It's kind of an enabling kind of regulation rather than a prohibition exercise. You mentioned something like the Cyber Resilience Act. I mean, this is an innovative kind of, approach to kind of lead market players, whether it's hardware or software, in the future to security by design solutions. And just to tell you that in the TTC, I mean, Americans are looking with great interest into that and say, hey, this is really interesting and we want to kind of, exchange on that. The important thing also is the data strategy and what we did there. I come from data protection. I was involved in the GDPR, as some of you might know. Yes, this was a promise at the time, not only to protect the fundamental right, but also to be innovation friendly. Hasn't fully delivered, has many reasons. But I think that's why it was super important in this commission to come with a strong data strategy and to say, we must not lose this kind of next wave of data. And I think if you look at Data Act, or if you look at the work on the data spaces, the common data spaces in areas such as health, I mean, who would have thought that we would come that far? This is a huge treasure for a kind of, European companies, European startups to untap that potential, get out of the silos where all the kind of, in the kind of, more all connected kind of goods structures, all is locked in, and this time not in American social media companies, but in kind of, European big industrial players companies, and is opened up because the users can choose where to give the data to kind of, steer innovation. I really have a strong belief that if we fill that with life, if this is not only a paper tiger, nice to have, but we fill it with life, this is the kind of the key ingredient that we need to kind of make the AI innovation a reality in Europe. But it's equally important to really play a role as the EU in kind of being at the technological forefront. We're not yet where we should be. There are areas where I think we could have done better, cloud being one. But when you look at, for instance, the supercomputing, I mean, here, I think through the joint actions that we have taken, we are now playing in the league of the supercomputers of the world. And this is, again, the computing capacity is a potential that you need if you want to kind of, run your big kind of generative AI models. And hence, the kind of the piece that we did recently to accompany the AI Act with the AI innovation package, where we will open the kind of the access to the hyperscaler kind of supercomputers to the AI innovators, is a huge kind of, door opening for potential solutions in the EU. So it's really just thinking this together that is a powerful thing. But you also need the policy context. And that's the kind of, the 2030 targets that we have given ourselves. The targets to kind of to bring us all up to speed. That means super infrastructure, connectivity, public administration that should be digital, business that should go digital, in particular the small and medium-sized ones, and the skills agenda. Europe doesn't have the strongest kind of competence on skills and will never have. But we can, of course, when kind of filling, again, this 2030 target process with a little bit of, impetus, we can create peer pressure. Because we can every year report where Germany, the country I know best, stands, and it's not such a good story to tell. And that can have an impact for national debates. And it's also interesting, I chair sometimes the Digital Decade Board, and when you see the kind of the members from the different kind of member states coming together and comparing notes, that it can also be, I mean, we have smaller, we have bigger ones, we have champions in this area, on that area, to learn from each other and to have the best practice. This is unfinished business and needs to continue. Last but not least, of course, we should never, even if resilience, economic security have to be on our agenda in these days. We cannot kind of pretend that it's still the world that I kind of, started when I started with trade policy 20 years ago in the DG and in the Commission. We have to live with the world we live in. And in that kind of context, of course, we should remain open, but we also have to kind of, deal with it in the best interest of the EU. Hence, alliances with partners are really important, but they have to be diverse. It has to be driven by our European interest. And I think this will be a task also for the next Commission. So, for the next mandate, yes, I think there is some unfinished business. Tomorrow we are going to roll out our white paper on connectivity, watch the space. So that's an important theme for the future, because indeed you can't forget about, having the data, to have the AI applications, but then not be able to run the kind of the automated car, because there you need the kind of the constant data transmission, storage, whatever, connectivity. And that with the white spots that we have everywhere in the European Union still now, not going to work. So we really have to kind of catch up there. I think this is an important theme for the future. You mentioned others, data retention, disaster. I think there are some themes that we should kind of at least bring back on the table. And, because that's part of, unfinished the single market. So I think that's indeed an important, aspect. We have to stay on our toes when it comes to technological kind of race. Here, we have to be on the forefront of technological developments, quantum, encrypted quantum technology being one. There Europe has to play a role, as we played a role in the past on kind of the supercomputing. I think also it's true that it is not impossible to understand our digital rule books, but it's complex. And so I'm with you that, I think for the next Commission there will be a task, and I see it already in some of the works that we do post-adoption of legal acts, but I think it has to become more mainstream, that the Commission has a work, after an act is published in the official journal, a more proactive, role. In order to help everybody to understand the rules, to give guidance to the rules, to bring the players together, to make the enforcement work, even if it's a decentralized kind of enforcement structure with the member states' authorities in the lead, we can still ensure that it's as harmonized approach as possible. So I think this kind of change in perspective, that enforcement, effective implementation of the rules is the rule of the game, has to kind of change. That also means that you have to think the things through in a more coherent way. You have the Data Act has an implication on the AI Act, so that has to be read together. The DSA has rules for platforms, has to be read together with generative AI kind of models, because they might become very large online platforms once, who knows. So we really have to bring this coherence, and we have to lead that debate on the coherence, definitely. And I think we also need to make sure, as you mentioned, that Europe can be fully untap the potential of being at the heart of the next IT productivity boom. Because I think if we link this all well together and give the right signals, what is already shaping as key themes for the next Commission, competitiveness, economic security, then I think we can, maybe also support innovation and entrepreneurship in the European Union more than we have managed to do in this kind of crisis mode that we've been here. Because we have a lot of good research. We have a lot of good startups, but indeed we don't see them scaling up. We see them kind of going elsewhere. And I think it's not only a question of the capital union, capital market union, it's really a question of creating this environment, looking at the best kind of, part of Europe. That's probably not a Silicon Valley in one place only in the EU, but to think of the Silicon Valley as the EU, since we have the digital kind of possibilities to also run companies in a different way. So I think there are many sectors where we could actually, when you move to the virtual worlds, whether that's kind of digital twins, whether that's gaming, whether that's medicine, whether that's education, where we could play a super important role if we create these alliances and think European from the start, and not having kind of, a Silicon Valley in Innsbruck or in Prague or in Munich or wherever. So I think that's the potential, strength of it all. I also would think that staying united with international partners will remain an important theme. I hope that the transatlantic relationship can be, strong again, also in the next mandate. And I believe that with what we have created with the TTC, not only at the top level, because the top levels might change, also at the level of commissioners talking, but actually the whole working structures, the whole kind of, setup that we have created of talking about big themes, like online harm or 6G or Open RAN or whatever, that these can be relationships that will be stable enough to kind of carry us through the next phase, whatever it means in terms of political leadership. So far from me.
Renate, I wanted to cut you off, but I kept listening and listening, and I couldn't bring myself to cut you off just as well. Fascinating, by the way, your comment towards the end, Renate, about this new responsibility of the Commission to play a more proactive role in implementation, not just being a policewoman or a policeman of how acts are implemented at the national level, but actually helping stakeholders to understand the legislation. I think that's a really interesting point. Finally, to you, Axel. So also a similar question to you in the sense that the next European Parliament, we know what you've done so far. That's a fact, and your instrumental role in all that. But give us a hint, maybe, as best you can, in predicting how you think the next European Parliament will address some of these tech issues. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. So what I liked most was the expression filling with life. And this is probably what we need. I'm quite confident right now. So if Roberto Viola and Renate Nikolay, our prince and princess of digital development, so that we are come out trying to move forward and filling this with life. And so at first, of course, we have now decided more than less on the AI Act. And so now we need to fulfill this fill this with life, especially the enforcement. There's one problem, of course, how to enforce your personal rights, individual rights, copyrights, blah blah, in the generative AI mode. So here we have to think about. We need to push at first more in a practical way the Commission in setting up the AI office, what you have done already, and also you have came up with the communication already with some ideas. Now we would like to see this execution of these ideas as soon as possible. And what we also need here are the guidelines. So if you're asking me, I would say the wording of especially Article 6 in this way is very vague in this AI Act. And here we need mitigating the legal uncertainty, what this is creating. And I hope this will not be true at the end, but if we are then seeing this legal uncertainty for 2 years in the transition period and then additional 2 years to clarify something, I would ask the Commission already in doing this beforehand. And just to make clear what is needed and what we do need, and use cases and finding out what is acceptable and what not, that we're coming forward with these. I think Zach was mentioning this interpretation of the law. Also, I have high expectations on the Commission that this is delivering already something that we do not have the same situation like in the GDPR, where every member state is interpreting the rules differently, and in just cross-border cases, then we are coming to a solution. We are a bit better in the AI regulation, AI Act, but we need to be better anyway, so in this regard. Also, trying to sort out the overlaps, not only with the legal tools. I have in mind these medical device directive and so on. There might be others, and you might help also if you're detecting some of these overlaps, let us know. But also the overlapping in governance structures. So if we're coming to AI and financial issues, all of a sudden you might be confronted with the AI office might be, but then data protection administration, then probably the competition administration, and all of a sudden also the European Central Bank. And this is something what I would like to see. This is more simplified, that we have a more simplified approach on this. Also, coming back also to AI, the AI Act, and you have mentioned these already. Do we need really in every member state a kind of a sandbox, or shouldn't we come forward with something where we have sandboxes for special sectors throughout the member states? But as long, so this might be a kind of a mentality question in the member states. So especially in Germany, you have Bundesland competing with Bundesland, and then on the European level you have these member states competing with other member states, and this is not the best way forward. If we can consider and funding these to come up with some of these sandboxes in concentrating on some sectors, this would be probably more promising. What we also should think about, and also this was mentioned already, access to quality data. I'm not sure if we have achieved this already, and probably we should find a way forward to it. Of course, then in addition, next mandate we will focus also on the AI liability, what we haven't done so far now, but we have to prepare this and solving this question. My dream, of course, is also that we are getting a modernization of the GDPR. So I'm running since 4 years or 5 years here against the same walls, then internally of the parliament, but also in the commission, because everyone thinks, oh, our golden standard, you can't touch it, and blah, blah, blah. But this is not really helping. So far, that's why I would say modernization of the GDPR would be quite good. Then we should prepare also ourselves regarding the metaverse. I know this is not a kind of a very actual problem, but we should avoid the situation what we have experienced with social media, where we all of a sudden have to think about how we can get rid of some problems and get rid of some content of platforms and so on. And here we should prepare ourselves beforehand, that everyone knows if you're creating something, then this should have this frame. It doesn't need probably a kind of a detailed regulation, but we should give everyone a kind of an idea what we are meaning. You mentioned also quantum computing. We should prepare ourselves also what does this mean for security, for research and so on, preparing ourselves what should we do right now in giving this a frame. I mentioned already the governance structure. This is what I think we should also simplify. In a kind of a smaller approach, of course, we have to think about autonomous and smart contracts and how to deal with this. If your fridge is ordering something or the self-driving car is coming along and proving if I have paid my rent for it and so on, that all of a sudden a machine is deciding on you and so on. So this is more a kind of a legal aspect. It's not really the way forward for competition issues and so on. But this is also something what we probably need to do. What I'm hoping that we also should come to is a kind of flexibility of a legislator. This is what we mentioned already 5 or 4 years ago in this digital manifesto and also in the AIDA report. I think we can't go on like, if I may use the example of GDPR once again, and saying, once we have decided, we look 5 or 6 years later on it. No, I think we should concentrate what is going into the wrong direction and how we can fix it immediately. This would be better instead of waiting and then evaluating and having all these whole process in mind. Here also, this would be a dream for me in having a kind of an legitimate or democratic result after 3 months. Having a situation, focusing on it, and then saying how we can fix these in a way forward. TTC, you mentioned this one. Probably we should use the TTC also in widening these for, let's say, more Western allies in a way, that we have Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, etc. on board, that we have a kind of a wonderful, more than less global way forward. This would be all my points so far, but I'm quite open for other ideas and to push the Commission the whole 5 upcoming years with other ideas. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Axel. And widening the TTC to the United Kingdom as well. You forgot to mention the UK. By the way, if I understand you correctly, Axel, your last point about, let's not wait for sort of 5-year reviews before looking at something is kind of the other side of the coin to Renate's point about the Commission taking more responsibility maybe for how laws are enacted at the national level. Then you'll come along and if you give the political cover for that as the European Parliament, that seems to me like a perfect coming together of very sensible approaches. We have about 10-15 minutes. Axel has to leave us shortly after 6. So now is a chance for you to quiz our panel. Yes, excellent. There's a microphone. Yes, hi there. This lady here in the black. So if you mind giving your name and organisation and keep your question as brief as possible,
yeah,
please. Thank
sure. My name is Razia. Is this working? Yeah? Yeah. My name is Razia Akoch. I work for Agence France Presse, AFP news agency. So in a bid to keep the question quick, first one I wanted to ask, Renate mentioned the white paper tomorrow, and Zach, you also mentioned it as well. So this question is probably perhaps more to you, but maybe Renate wants to. Because there's been a leak of the white paper, and I wanted to ask, do you have concerns, or do you find that it meets your expectations from what you've seen so far? And there's a key question in all of this, which your paper also references. So it's not meant to be a critical point, but we're talking about the future mandate. But we have such big legislation. We really need to ask the question about enforcement. Do you have concerns about enforcement? Because Axel, you also mentioned it, and so I'd like to ask: can we enforce it? Do we have enough resources?
The panel hasn't got to answer every question. We'll take it one at a time. Who wants to? Renate, you were no. Okay, you're not commenting. Okay, very briefly, Zach.
I can answer these two questions quite quickly. Am I happy with the leaked version of the white paper? Yes, I think that broadly speaking, the focus is on exactly what I recommend in the paper, which is how do we get European telecoms operators to, to scale across Europe so that there's more intense competition and so that they have the efficiencies that are needed to kind of build out infrastructure, which is going to need to be in place for years and years to come. So they need more certainty. Yes, I think that broadly speaking, the direction of the white paper looks good, and I'm equally pleased that it seems to me that based on that draft, the Commission's backed away from some options like this proposal that big tech companies should be paying telecoms operators for the use of infrastructure, which I think it really opens up a can of worms in terms of what the consequences are for things like net neutrality, which I think is kind of a fundamental principle to the way that the internet is built. And when we look at the consequences of that type of proposal in countries like South Korea, it really hasn't been positive for consumers.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry, second on the second question? On implementation.
You need to be very strict with the speakers, that includes you as well. Okay.
On implementation and enforcement, completely right. If I have one maybe slight quibble with some of the ideas that my fellow panelists have raised, is that there's a lot of them, and that I completely agree with Renate that passing a law is only the start. Implementation is just a huge, huge challenge. I've got an example in here about the Digital Markets Act, where there's, I think, like 150 enforcers. But you look at the UK, it's got a much more kind of tailored model where the rules are going to be focused on 1 or 2 companies at a time, and yet they have 200 people doing it. So it's very difficult to imagine that we're going to be able to do it as well as we could.
You have to be much briefer. There's so many questions in the room. Renate, quickly.
I just want to kind of make a point on enforcement, because we had yesterday on the DSA, the first DSC board. So I really want us to kind of also on enforcement of some of the rules, even where the Commission has, like in the DSA and the DMA, a kind of a central regulators kind of enforcement role for the bigger ones. I think we have to look at this as an ecosystem of enforcement structure in the EU. When I was yesterday in the room, with these 27 kind of, digital service coordinators, some of them didn't yet have their full kind of, but they were allowed as observers. So we had the 27 around the room. That's a very powerful kind of Team Europe that enforces together. Because now the citizens will know where to put their kind of, complaints to in the member states they're sitting in. And, nobody will kind of escape. Also, the smaller platforms will be covered under the obligations and watched. So I think one has to look at that also a little bit together. It's not only about who sits in headquarters here in Brussels, on enforcement. We really have to get more to this Team Europe approach on enforcement.
Thank you, Renate. The gentleman over there.
Mark Dempsey, Article 19. in a personal capacity, I'm not going to mention enforcement or not, so don't worry. But 10 years ago, I was working for the Financial Conduct Authority. What was the question then? CMU. Will there be CMU? So realistically, could CMU happen under the next 5-year commission? Or, I mean, is it even worth putting on the agenda? Because again, scalability, keeping startups in Europe.
Is that a yes/no answer, maybe? Who wants to answer the CMU question? Axel?
So if we are ambitious enough and not too complicated, and so then I would see light at the end of the tunnel. So for me, everything is now more than less a question of, are we surviving digitally in Europe? So for me, it's extremely urgent, everything. So I'm coming more from this approach. And so that's why I would say we need to. It's probably so essential already that we need to come forward with everything. So, and I hope there is a kind of openness in the member states, and this is the most problematic, probably the change of mindset in the member states. We should take them out of the thinking of the last century, especially in digital areas. And so I see this very problematic, but we have to. I do not see what is otherwise our ambition to go and to survive. And here, therefore, I would ask everyone in helping to come forward with.
Renate, are you more optimistic?
Yes, I think the CMU is a must-have, and I would be very surprised if the Draghi and Letta report did not point it out.
Thank you, Renate. Lady here.
Yes, I'm Kateřina Šafariko. I'm a Czech correspondent here in Brussels. I have a question to Milena Jabůrková on your 5 recommendations you mentioned at the beginning. You mentioned that we have to complete the single market. Everybody's talking about it. Even Ursula von der Leyen is saying we must complete single market. So what are you missing? I mean, what should be completed first place? Thank you.
Milena.
I think we need a will to complete it, and we are working on concrete recommendations with Europe Unlocked, and it must become a political priority. As I said, it was much ado about nothing yet, and that has to change because it's, as I said, be or not to be question.
Lady here.
Thank you. Amélie Coulet from IBM. I have a question for Renate about the TTC, which you mentioned earlier. And I fully agree with you that this infrastructure that this has created could be really useful for the future. There's been some success with the TTC for sure, but one can also argue that maybe it hasn't really delivered the way that perhaps it was envisioned at the beginning. Do you have already had some discussion about how this could potentially be improved, reform over the next couple of months? For example, Axel Voss, really good suggestion about perhaps broadening the TTC to something more global, or at least with like-minded partners, just focusing on the EU-US. Is this something you've discussed? Anything you can share on the future of the TTC would be quite interesting. Thank you.
Renate, back to you.
I think that when you look at, I mean, of course, I look at it from my digital kind of prism, and there we have digital partnerships more broadly. We have a similar kind of engagement with India. We are quite established with Japan and Korea. I'm going in 4 weeks' time to Brazil to kind of, establish something there. So I think this is a web of, let's say, digital partnerships that are always following a little bit, the common interest that is useful. Would I believe that we could bring that together to some plurilateral kind of de facto, I don't know. I think it's a dream. I mean, personally, I would dream of a Bretton Woods for digital at some stage, but I think that's in the geopolitical context we're in probably a very, very wild dream, but it's good to have them. But I think, what is important is that we as the EU stand for these these international engagements. There aren't at the moment, we are still having a TTC, under the Belgian presidency, there will still be a TTC. So this is also to manifest, we believe in that. So I think it's at the moment too early because it will depend on the partners on both sides to design that. And the TTC with the US had some very tough kind of trade issues also included. And there's a very good partner for us in the White House in many regards. But on trade policy, it has been a difficult discussion. Also with this administration over the last years. That's also simply a matter of fact.
Thank you. Gentleman with the glasses.
Hi, thank you. Carl Heinemann from the UK mission to the EU. Question for perhaps everybody, but more for Renate maybe. Where do you see UK-EU relations headed on digital? Do you think what we've got in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is sort of enough, or should that sort of expand in the future in the next mandate? Yeah.
Right. Who wants to answer that? Future UK relation with the EU on this, Renate. Poor Renate, she regret coming here now.
Well, I'm very pleased with the kind of, re-engagement ever since the Windsor Agreement, I would say. And, I think you have seen the most recent example on illegal migration. I think it's a pragmatic, useful approach. I think it's always better to have, EU and UK as allies together, fighting for the kind of issues, but I don't see us engaging in another, tough, reopening of the contractual relationship in the near future. I really also don't think that would be the best way of using our resources. I think choices were made, and that's a matter of fact too. But that doesn't mean that, whether it's the kind of, what kind of, future we want to design with allies on AI, where the summit hosted by the Prime Minister of the UK was a very useful kind of contribution, but isn't to be seen in isolation because it followed on something that the Japanese in the G7 Hiroshima process really started. So that's how I would see that. UK is an important partner, but it's a partner amongst others.
Yes.
Just to say that UK, for us, for example, Czech businesses, it's our key partner. We do business with UK, and even with Ukraine crisis, UK leadership proved to be instrumental. So I think it's a key partner which deserves special relationships, and I hope that political leadership here and in the UK will work on.
Zach.
I'll just say with two short things. One, Renate might not say it, of course, but it seems likely that we'll probably have a change of government in the UK over the next year, and I don't see any kind of massive changes in the UK-EU relationship, but maybe a softening in certain areas. And I think digital is the potential for one where it seems like there'd be really great synergies on something like digital competition. It makes total sense for the UK and the EU to align their rules as far as possible, because you're a small tech developer. You want to be able to follow the same rules in the UK and in Europe when you're dealing with tech giants. And similarly, I think those tech giants probably would, in principle, support having a single set of rules for when they do business. So, I think the closer they can work together, the better for digitalisation in both blocks.
Thank you. Gentlemen, any more questions after this gentleman, so I can wrap up? No? So you have the last word, so go for it.
Okay, so I'm Alexander Strel from the University of Namur and Serre. So, Zach, I think all your proposals are very good, but then I wanted to go to the policy makers. And how do you think the incentive of the Commission and the Parliament could be aligned to those things? Because my impression is that the impact assessment, the quality of the impact assessment that the Commission has done under this Commission has gone down by a lot, and maybe it's for good reason because you had to act fast, but clearly I think the impact assessment is less good than before, and the Parliament sometimes, we have the impression that the role of the Parliament is to legislate mostly in the short-term interest, okay? Now, it's not a critical view, of course, but it's just I'm trying to analyze the incentive of the institution and how we can be sure that those incentives are better aligned to get what Zach wants. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Maybe Axel first, then Renate, then I'll wrap up.
The problem of the parliament is that we have to compromise so far between 7 different political groups. And there we are complicating things. So even if you're looking to the AI Act, there's something integrated what I would consider shouldn't be there. But to have this party on board, we take also nonsense on board. So, and this is then something where I would say we are complicating lives sometimes in the parliament in the whole. But still, I think if we would agree on some strategies, and I think this is really needed, kind of a strategy and the execution of this strategy at the end, also regarding money and so on and funding, then I would say we can align, but again, the driver's seat in this regard is always the Commission in pushing these forward. We have to push the Commission to push us as a legislator. And here I would say with the princess and prince of digital development, we can align a lot, but I hope the open-minded situation between these political parties might be hard to convince sometimes.
Thank you. Renate, you have the final word.
Well, I think it's still only the Commission doing impact assessments at all. Even though, and I've done several pieces of legislation in my career, even though a lot is sometimes being changed in the context. And not the Council, not the Parliament adds impact assessment. I would also dare say that this mandate hasn't been a normal mandate. I've seen other mandates, and I mean, let's take the energy, legislation, the energy actions that we had to take inevitably because we were, remember, 1.5 years ago, in a deep energy crisis, and we had to act. And, there's sometimes a conflict and a little bit of realpolitik coming in, that you have to kind of occupy the space and you have to give a direction. And there are sometimes clear demands from both co-legislators to do it fast. I mean, all the 122 kind of, initiatives that we had, I mean, who would have thought? I wouldn't have thought as a law student that would ever be applied, So, this isn't a normal mandate. So I would really suggest that in your analysis, you take that into account. We hardly had started, and I was a head of cabinet at the time, so I can really also testimony from the years that I spent in that role. It's been constant crisis management, and that's a different context from, a commission that acts in a different setup.
Very briefly from Milena, then me.
I have to react as those who has the skin in the game and they are impacted by this regulation. This, for the next commission, is very important to make it right, because it harms us when it's not when there is not quality assessment, and a lot of times that was the case. So this must change.
Thank you. That's perfect. It's a wrap. What strikes me about today's discussion, this evening's discussion, is there's obviously very profound analysis, very thoughtful analysis of what needs to be done, but most importantly, and relatively unique in Brussels, relatively rare in Brussels, is people coming forward with ideas of how to improve things, but practical ideas, not just broad brush solutions. So I think that's been a really wonderful takeaway from today's discussion. I thank you all very much for that. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Europe Unlocked for commissioning the study from the CER. Thank you for those of you who asked questions. Thank you for the panel. You talked about Axel, the prince and the princess. I hope that does not mean we're talking about hope it means we're not talking about a fairy tale, but real things. Okay. And your last task before disappearing is to give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you very much.